Good evening, everyone who's joining us from Germany, some people in Austria as well. It's great to see so many of you saying hi in the chat field, telling us a little bit about where you are, where you're from. So many different places there in that I've been to before, that I really miss, that I'd love to go back to really soon. But for now, I'm really happy to have you all here for the next hour or so to think a little bit about active learning. What is it? Why it's important? And how we can use it in our teaching, specifically in online teaching. And one of the elements of that, which is, or one of the characteristics of it, which can be student-led learning, and what exactly that is, and how we can kind of set that up to, to use potentially more of this approach in teaching, again, specifically online. I'm not going to mention online every time I mention an activity idea, because all of these ideas that I'm going to run through with you can be used and easily online, either in breakout rooms, in group discussions, using the chat field, using polls, and so on. Yet, I think most of what I'm going to cover with you can also be used in a face-to-face classroom, so you can apply these back to a face-to-face environment when you get back into one, basically. So I'm going to assume everyone can hear me okay. And I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat field. So if you do have questions or comments, please do throw them in there, and I'll do my best to react to them, to engage with them. But as you were just informed, the recording of this session is not going to include the chat thread. So your questions or your identities won't necessarily be revealed in the recording itself. So that's why I'll react in the way I do when I have a look at it. But hi everyone from Switzerland as well. Awesome. Switzerland, Austria, loads of different places in Germany. So thinking about active learning and why this is important, okay, as a teaching approach, as a teaching methodology, but also as a life skill. Okay, every 5 years, the World Economic Forum does a lot of research and compiles it into a report which they call the Future of Jobs report. And they look at what the core workplace skills are going to be in 5 years from when they published that report. And so in October of last year, they published the Future of Jobs Report 2020, in which they looked at the way the world of work has been developing and changing over the previous 5 years. They did a lot of research, spoke to a lot of people, and as a result of that, they came up with what they believe are going to be the top 10 skills, workplace skills of 2025. So here they are. Some of them might not be a surprise to you. Some of them might be a surprise to you. You'll notice that many of them don't necessarily involve technical skills, but pretty much all of them, maybe with the exception of number 8 and maybe number 7, but pretty much all the rest of them look at how we develop as humans and how we think, how we interact with the world around us, and how we interact with other people in the world around us. And so all of these kind of social skills, or what we might call social emotional skills, are going to be crucial. They're crucial even today, but they're going to be even more important in the future world of work. And so whether you are teaching adults or children or teenagers, you know, this is a really important thing to think about in general. And so active learning strategies are going to be one of the things that will set people apart in their ability to succeed in the workplace in the future. So I just like to kind of begin from that starting point. There is a micro link on the slide to where you can actually find the report. But if you just do an online search for World Economic Forum Future of Jobs Report 2020, you'll find it pretty easily. And if you don't go through the report itself, they also have executive summaries. They've got really nice infographics that you can take and use as well. So, you know, even just discussing this as a topic with your learners is something which is going to raise awareness around the skills that they do need or will need to succeed in the workplace. So let's think about active learning itself. What is active learning? Actually, yeah, before I dive in, give me some ideas in the chat field. I see we've got representation from Portugal as well today, which is awesome. So in the chat field, what's active learning? Learner autonomy. So it can definitely encourage learner autonomy. It can encourage learners to take ownership of their learning. It can encourage learners to be more independent about their learning, to take responsibility for their learning, to take care about the news. So to be actively involved in the world around them, to be curious, to be hungry for learning, to go out there and seek knowledge, to decide what I want to learn, to prioritize my learning, to think about why am I prioritizing my learning. So this is very much in contrast to expecting the teacher to decide on what will be learned and then provide it like food on a spoon or an injection of some kind. It takes the responsibility off the teacher and places it also onto the learner. So I think that's a key and crucial part. So it's very much a student-centered approach, which focuses very much on how students learn, as opposed to what they learn. The core focus is thinking about how, and it encourages them to engage with their learning, you know, to be actively involved in it, and as many of you have mentioned here as well, to take the lead in it. And it's as we mentioned, it not only can it lead to higher levels of autonomy and independence, but also to higher levels of retention. Because if the learners themselves are kind of identifying what it is that's relevant for them and what it is they want to learn about, they're more likely to be engaged in it, they're more likely to connect with it, so they're more likely to retain what they're learning and use it later as well, rather than kind of learning content for no apparent reason, let's say. And it's often spoken about in contrast with passive learning. And so passive learning might take the form of a lesson which involves a lot more teacher talking time, maybe more lecture style approaches where students are maybe not actively engaging with each other or communicating actively in the lesson, and they're maybe note taking more. And this brings with it also risks of, you know, dropping engagement, attention dropping, distractions happening. And I'm just talking about a face-to-face classroom. When you're in a virtual classroom, the risk of this happening is even greater, because there are so many windows open, and you know, how can you be sure learners aren't checking their emails or surfing the internet or something like that if they're not being engaged and if the content is not relevant for them? So if those things are going down, the chances of distraction and disengagement pretty much go up. Okay, so this is just a little bit about what it is and what it's not. Thinking about why it's important or why use it as an approach. One of the most effective ways to learn a second language is through interaction. This is one of the core tenets of Michael Long's interaction hypothesis, in which he basically stated that people will learn a language by using it and by interacting with each other. So the more interaction that we have amongst learners, even if it's without an agenda, even if it's without a specific focus, just the activity of interacting with each other is going to help learners acquire new language, develop the language that they have, and see them using the language in action, and that's going to have a more motivational effect on them as well. So this is one of the core, underlying elements of why active learning is really important, because learners are going to learn more through interacting, on one hand. On the other hand, interactions in active learning can also help them develop more higher order thinking skills. So I can see someone in the chat wrote a moment ago about different approaches to learning, discussing problems, problem solving. And so when we think of higher order learning or higher order thinking skills, quite often this is spoken about in relation to Bloom's taxonomy of learning, where we think of, well, what does it mean? What ways do learners interact with learning? When you learn something, that the lowest level is you remember what has been presented to you, or you remember the learning that you've had without necessarily understanding it fully yet, or actually applying it into real communication. And so these lower ones are known as lower order thinking skills, in contrast to the higher order thinking skills where learners really become independent with what it is that they've been learning, and they become creative in ways to use their learning and in ways to evaluate what it is that they have been learning or want to learn, or the time and effort that they have been spending on their learning. And so this is just a quick kind of a run through around the future work skills, why active learning is important, what exactly active learning is, what categorizes it, and from a language learning point of view, why is it something that we should be trying to use as much of as we can in our learning, in our teaching, and encouraging it in our learners. So one way to approach active learning is with what we call student-led learning. So what do you think student-led learning looks like in your courses, in your teaching? So I'm not talking about them autonomously reading the news, reading books, doing the other things that we might have been speaking about. But imagine in your actual lessons, in your courses, if you were to adopt more of a student-led learning approach, what might it look like? What might be different? So give me a few ideas in the chat field. What do you think? Okay, we've got role plays, following their interests, letting the learners define and decide on the content of the lesson, for example. Getting the learners to bring their materials into the lesson, their ideas into the lesson. More group work, more interaction. Big limit on teacher talking time. Have them decide and prepare topics, introduce topics. Thinking about which questions to work with. Set up a problem for them, give them a choice of materials, let them decide about methods or methodology. Okay, great. So there's lots of ideas that you have here. And so the focus is around creating more autonomy for the learners, not only outside of the lessons, but also in the lessons, and switching the pace focus from being a teacher-driven pace and format to deciding on what, as well as how, the learners would want to learn or feel that they might best learn. Okay, so, and it's about just having those open dialogues and discussions with learners, because, okay, they're not pedagogically trained the way you are. So, it holds that you will most likely know more about learning theory than they will, but they will be experiencing learning. So they may know and feel things about their learning that you can't be assuming. So just engaging them in a conversation around this topic can help you provide more outcome-rich learning experiences for them, and also enable them to have more of a hand in their learning and in their outcomes. So what does it look like, just to kind of pick up on what you've said there? It's around less lecture style approaches, around less teacher talking time. It's around more collaboration, more group work, more autonomy for learners, providing teacher support and facilitation as and when it's needed. So as a teacher, maybe it's about switching our roles a little bit from maybe a more traditional perspective of knowledge owner and distributor of knowledge to facilitator of learning and guide and mentor, and being there to open doors of curiosity or doors of knowledge for learners, being there to help nudge the learning experience along without necessarily directing it from the outset. Providing a framework for them in which learning can thrive and learning can happen. So it's not about a free-for-all where everyone just does what they want, but it's about creating a framework within which they can have freedoms to lead the lesson or the course in certain directions. Now, you'll obviously still have your hierarching course goals or maybe a syllabus that you might have to follow in some way, but it's about seeing where does the flexibility lie in that for your learners to take more ownership, take more of a lead, be more active in the learning experience. So so that's a bit about the kind of the what and the why and the how. I know you're also here looking for ideas, and I love talking about ideas and actually stuff that goes on in the classroom. So I'm going to switch now to the second kind of part of today's webinar, is to just look at a range of different activity types and examples of things that you can do in your teaching, in your online lessons. Also apply it into your face-to-face ones as well. Some of the ideas you've already written about in the chat field, and I'll give you examples from some of the ideas that I've used in my teaching and some of the ideas that have made their way into the books that I've written. And so generally everything that's in the books that I've written actually came from classroom practice as opposed to from somewhere else. So the first example to think about is student presentations, which links in a little bit with what someone in the chat field said a moment ago about role plays. And I think it's useful at this point to distinguish between what we call a role play and a simulation. And so a role play is where we provide the learners with a role, we provide them with a framework within which to have their communication and their interaction with each other, and then we kind of sit back and let them do it. And the advantages of role plays is that it helps set up the context for learners. It removes potential pressure or challenge of them having to creatively think of a context or a situation in which they might need to actually communicate around this topic. But simulations are slightly different in that you can set up the same scenario. So in this example here, it's around student presentations. And so a simulated student presentation would be around asking learners, well, think of a realistic situation where you might have to present something in English. What is that situation? Who's involved in it? And which vocabulary and phrases are you going to need? So in this sense, you're letting them come up with the answers, but you're providing a framework of questions to help guide them to a context which is ultimately going to be driven and led by them. So this is one approach to enabling your learners to take more control and ownership in the lesson. So the overall topic maybe that you want to cover is presentations, but you let them define and decide on the actual content. So this is one way that you could do it. Another way is with a peer teaching situation. Involve knowledge that the learners have from their own context, from their own experience of the world or their jobs or traveling or maybe where they're from or something like that, and just enable them to engage in discussions around familiar topics. And so here's an example where we were talking about organizational culture, and just thinking about the culture of the organizations in which your learners might work, and getting them reflecting on the things that they like about it or might find frustrating, or what a decision-making process is like, or what's autonomy like in that situation, in that working environment, how task-oriented is the environment versus people-focused. And so there's a range of different ways that you can kind of draw on their knowledge, draw on their experience, get them working actively with each other. So here, this is just an example of an activity where you're getting learners to discuss and write their own tips, their own cultural tips for working in organizations or for working across cultures. And so on one hand, this is taking a very active learning approach. Building on that, you can decide how much to adapt such an activity to enable it to be more student-led or maybe less student-led, but still active. The key here is that with little setup from you, the learners can have a lot of live interaction. So it takes the focus off you, puts it on them for their discussions, for their interaction, for their small group creation, for when they play it back to a larger group, for a larger class discussion, things like that. So there's so many, again, it comes back to the idea of taking the focus off the teacher as knowledge owner and actually giving that focus to all of the learners, because they all have a lot of very rich knowledge that you can tap into in the lesson and get them sharing that with each other. And so another kind of activity type, another way that you can draw on that is to think about the specialist knowledge that they might have that might very much be of interest for the others in the group. So again, kind of keeping with a workplace context, thinking about the topic of delegating, if that's a topic that comes up for you in your group, you could engage your learners by getting them to think first about how they interact with delegating. Are they often on the receiving end of it or the giving end of it? What does delegating look like in their workplace context and in their situation, in their scenario? You could ask them to define, well, where do you want to go with this topic? What might be useful for you? Or if there is someone who has particular experience in this skill, you could get them to share that knowledge with the others in the group. And this can be very easily done in a virtual session, virtual teaching, either where one person is sharing to the whole group, or you can put them into mini groups, breakout rooms, and get them sharing their knowledge around a particular subject or topic in smaller groups. Even get them to lead on what the topic might be. The example here with delegating, so what I did is I did exactly that a couple of years ago. I have a good friend called Danny. Danny is based in Berlin, and he works in finance and investment consulting and stuff like that. He's worked in various team leadership positions in the past. And so I said to Danny, when I was writing this content, I was thinking, well, look, I'd like to put something on delegating into the book for the learners because this is a relevant skill. Rather than me coming up with my own list, can I interview you on what you think about delegating and what your experience of delegating is? And so I did, and then made a series of activities around it, which both pulled out the linguistic focus of the interview in terms of vocabulary and words that were relevant when speaking about that topic, but also, topic-based discussions and questions for the learners to engage them not only linguistically on learning about being able to speak about delegating and to do delegating, but also the actual skill itself. You might call it a soft skill or a leadership or a team skill of actually delegating. The reason I've put this all on here as well is because I want to give this to you as an actual activity you can use in your lessons with your classes. So, feel free to screenshot this now, make it go on full screen, or you can do that later. But also the video of that particular interview is available free for you online to use. So I'm just gonna, someone beat me to it. Exactly, yeah, so there it is there. So if you want to take this away, have a look at the video. There's the page from the book that it came from. So that's a kind of a structured intro to the topic on delegating that you can do to kind of actively engage your learners on this subject. And then maybe get them to pick a subject around, or them to decide on a subject around which they feel that they have some knowledge or some experience in, and maybe interview each other. Or this is the day of the age of selfies and mobile phones. Get them to record a 1-minute video selfie of them explaining their knowledge in a particular area of relevance around communication or collaboration or something from the workplace, and share that with the rest of the group. So if you're teaching online, you might have a learning environment, a hub of some kind, where you can upload or share such resources with each other, whether it's in Microsoft Teams or some other kind of environment like that. So that's kind of one approach you can take around knowledge sharing. Continuing on the topic of interviewing and on interviews, and moving on from delegating, if you're talking about working internationally, here's just an example of another one that I did in this context. The output wasn't a video, the output was an article. So that could practice your learners' writing skills, for example, as well. They could interview each other and write up the interview, actually, mock it up to look like an interview. So that's exactly what I did here, is I mocked it up to look like an interview in a magazine, which was based on a recording of a discussion that we had around this topic. So that in itself is another skill, is paraphrasing what someone says in a recorded discussion and transferring the spoken word down into the written word. So these are all ways to actively engage your learners, and you can let them lead on the output format. For example, you might say, well, do you want to do a video? Do you want to do an article? Do you want to do something else? Or even a podcast or something like that. So getting them to identify topics of relevance, getting them to identify how they're going to tap into the collective knowledge or each other's knowledge, and then getting them to also define, well, what's the output going to be? What's the output format going to be? Video, podcast, article, something else. And so giving this control to your learners will engage them more in the learning process as well. More on interviews. So there's a range of different examples. That's just another example that I put in an interview around building relationships in the workplace and the importance of building relationships. Again, tap into the people that you know personally in your own network. You all know people who have jobs in interesting companies and in interesting places. So do your learners. So get them to tap into their own network and find interesting people who can share their knowledge and their experience with the wider class, with the wider group. So some of you might know Chia. She's a teacher, a teacher trainer, communication skills expert as well. And so I said, well, look, I'd like to get your thoughts so that I can share them with my learners and with people who use the book. Another reason I've kind of shown her here on the slide as well is because she's also giving a webinar, a Cornelissen webinar in 2 days, actually, on Thursday at 12 o'clock, which is around engaging students in virtual classrooms. So if you are already signed up for that, you'll get a whole load of additional ideas from that one there as well. But moving on from the ideas of knowledge sharing and peer teaching and kind of real world discussions and interviews and things like that, another example of ways that you can actively engage your learners in their learning is through dilemmas or through critical incidents, as they're known. So some kind of a situation or a scenario where something's happening, where one or more people are experiencing some kind of difficulty or some kind of blockage, and then getting the learners themselves to discuss, well, where's this coming from? Or what would you do in that scenario or situation? So I've got one for you here, okay? Here's an example. Sven is visiting London on business for the first time. His host invites him out for a meal, and with a smile on her face, orders the speciality of the house for him: jellied eels with pie and mashed potatoes. Sven is in two minds. He can't even stand to look at the dish, let alone eat it. But he wants to maintain a good business relationship. What should he do? So in the chat field, give me your ideas. What should Sven do? He can say he's not hungry. So let's assume they've been working all day, or he's just landed off a flight or something like that, and everyone knows he is hungry. Okay, so we've got a selection of make some excuses to get out of it. Be honest. So I'm assuming that be honest maybe means I'd like to maintain a good relationship, but I don't know if I want to eat that thing. Ask the host whether they prefer honesty or politeness. That's a really interesting one. So in giving a preference, does that mean that the opposite is something that is acceptable or that they don't like? So let's say if I say I prefer politeness, is that me then saying, but it's okay if you lie to me? Or if I say I prefer honesty, even if it means you're potentially being impolite, and that's a really interesting topic or balance to have written there. Make up some more excuses, stomach troubles, things like that. So no one has actually yet said he should just eat it. Just get over it, eat it. Which is also interesting. I'm gonna just double check here. Can you still see and hear me okay? Can you give me a yes in the chat field if you can? Okay, brilliant, thank you. No, it's just my video screen is frozen at this end, so I just got a little nervous. Yeah, picture's frozen for me too, but I'm just gonna keep going. Yeah, interestingly enough, that Sven is actually me, and it did happen to me, but not in London, in a different part of the world. It's happened to me at least twice actually, and both times I have I've just kind of dove in and I've gone for it, and I've eaten whatever it was. But it's an interesting question, because a lot of people will have an opinion on it. A lot of people will have maybe their own experiences to share as well. From this activity, you could ask your learners, well, look, tell us about an experience you had in a different situation, in a situation which was unusual for you. What did you do? What did you learn from it? What can you share with the others? So again, putting the focus on the learners and them learning from each other and them sharing experience rather than necessarily you owning it or directing it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in this context, about relationships and food and eating. Here's another example just around ideas and different people's approaches to testing ideas. Here's just an example of, should someone test an idea by asking a larger group of people, by asking a smaller group of people? What other methods can you use to test ideas in this context when it's about naming a new initiative, a new innovation, a new product, something like that? So there's loads of different ways that you can use dilemmas and critical incidents in active learning approaches, and also getting learners to lead on it themselves by coming up with their own and by sharing their own. I turned off and turned the camera back on again, so thank you for confirming. You can see it all again now. Interesting. People have refused different things, refusing frogs' legs, or dive in and take a little bit of it. And so, I guess that in itself can just generate a rich conversation. Is something unexpected that happened to you when you were working or traveling in an environment in which the locals in which people had norms which were different to your own norms. And then even just having the conversation around norms can open up a whole world of self-reflection And this even ties back to many of those future of work skills that I was mentioning earlier on, just around critical thinking and analyses, social influence, how we interact on a sociological level with each other. So there's loads that you can kind of dive into from that particular activity. But just kind of wrapping up on a few of these ideas. So the examples that I've kind of run through around student presentations, peer teaching, real world discussions, knowledge sharing, interviewing to tap into that collective knowledge from each other, looking at dilemmas, critical incidents. You could also do project work or project-based learning as an approach, PBL, in which you could either create a framework for learners or get them to lead on it themselves, working in small groups and teams with a specific output in mind. That output could be, for example, creating a list of cultural tips for working within your organization, something that they might share with new joiners to an organization, or their top tips for working virtually if they've had to do a lot of it in the last 14 months. You know, you could create some kind of a collaborative project for your learners to work on, either in your live lessons in small breakout groups, or someone mentioned earlier on, through a kind of a flipped learning approach, maybe getting people to do pre-work themselves in their small groups independently, and then playing back their outcome to you in the lessons. TBL is another good approach that really lends itself well, or that links quite well with active learning approaches, in terms of giving learners specific tasks to do and complete without necessarily directing the approach that they take, but more just predefining what the output might be. So it could be solving a problem, for example. It could be coming up with a new idea for something. You might define what that is based on your syllabus or the contents of your course, but you might also let your learners define what that is based on their own interests and their own personal learning goals. And case studies. And case studies are, a really rich source of real world scenarios, let's say, whether it's a case study about a company, about a business, about something that happened to someone, about something that happened in their town or country or part of the world, or whatever it is. It depends on what they're interested in, but you could find a case study for them to study and to discuss and to create an output related to it. It could be a presentation or a piece of writing or something. Or you could even ask them to create their own case study based on something that is near to their own hearts, and share that with others so that others can learn from it, and that would give them writing practice in doing so in the first place. I think I got two more ideas on this particular slide. We've discussed, or we've touched on, problem solving as well already. And, not forgetting that their goal of being in your training and being in your lessons is to learn the language as well. Is, they can do some language research, research into, the differences between different approaches to learning, or the differences in how certain elements of language are constructed. So again, coming back to the idea of don't feel under pressure to be the owner of knowledge and distributor of learning and of knowledge, but more like a facilitator to help guide them into learning directions which will interest and engage them. So also with language research is, find out what areas of language might be useful or interesting for them, and encourage them to go find out more, either through pointing them to resources or just asking them to find out what they can, and playing that back then for the rest of the group, which links back in with knowledge learning and knowledge share as well. This is great. I can see the conversation is still on, or maybe I'm a little bit old, around certain things people have refused to eat in certain countries, certain animals, certain parts of animals, things like that. So, my advice to that, but I'm me, you're you, is I often think to myself, what's the worst thing that could happen if I eat this? And okay, I might feel a little unwell for a short period of time, but it will pass, and the learning from it is that I will then know what that thing tastes like. That's not to say that those of you who have refused those things you've written about didn't try it a previous time, learned that you didn't really like it, and then refused it the second time. Someone's also asked me, do I have any good sources for case studies? There are websites like MindTools. I think it's mindtools.com, or Business Balls is another one, where there are a range of different case studies available. It depends on what I might be looking for a case study on, to be honest with you. I read the news regularly and often, and I just look for interesting things that have happened in the news to bring into my training sessions, to engage learners with real world current things, and maybe just use that as a case which we can then study ourselves. So rather than creating an entire fully fledged case study, it's more like to create the seed of an idea or the seed of a discussion topic, and let the learners decide the depth, or the depth they want to go into on it, or the breadth that they want to look into this particular subject or topic matter on, would be another approach that I would take. Someone mentioned university as well. University websites are actually also a good source of case studies, especially if you go to the business or economics faculty of a university website. They may often have a selection of case studies which may be relevant for your learners if they're business learners, and depending on the length of time that you have available, or the depth into which you want to go. At a very basic or rudimentary level, the dilemmas that I just showed you about before could be seen as a case study, a micro case study. And on the other hand, you might have, a whole report around the history of a company that launched a well-known global product, and what they did in terms of research and marketing and product design and testing and launching and all of those things. It could balloon into a topic that you would address for a whole semester. So, it's a difficult thing to say, definitely go there for case studies and use those ones. It's more a case of think of these questions that I've just been asking, or these thoughts I've been sharing from my own mind as to how I might approach a desire to look for case studies that might be relevant. Someone's written, I ask my students from all over the world at the university in Germany that I'm in, what they don't understand about German culture. So that's an interesting approach to an activity. So the learners are they're actively involved, because if they're international students in that university in Germany, then they will have a direct connection to that question, because they will be experiencing German culture by virtue of the fact that they're in a German university. And maybe the output of that is you could create a list of questions to pass on to your other students that you might have if you have German students, or get them to share knowledge, share answers with each other. So if you've got 10 international students and 10 German students, and the international ones create a list of questions, these are the things I don't understand about German culture, please help me understand them. And then the Germans can help explain that. And so you're getting them to actively engage with each other, to learn from each other, and maybe even then to exchange such knowledge about other countries, about other parts of the world. Someone's observed people don't talk to each other on public transport. In different countries, you can observe lots of different things, and that's also a great source of critical incidents, is to just observe the world around you, and take note of things that you find that you have some kind of an emotional reaction to, whether it's something that frustrates you, or something you find funny or silly or unbelievable, or whatever it might be. If you're having an emotional reaction to it, others might too. So if you capture whatever that is, just in a few little lines, or even in a photo or a video, these days, pretty much all of us have devices in our pockets all the time that can take photos and videos. So just be curious around the world, about the world around you, and you will find case studies and critical incidents everywhere. So that would be kind of my other tip for you. So keeping an eye on the time, just wanted to say the examples that I showed you today, and the things that I spoke about have come from a selection of these books. These are the books that Özlem referenced earlier on at the beginning of the session, the ones that I've been involved in writing, with a focus on business English. But as I said before, if you don't teach business English and you teach general English, you can still use pretty much all of the ideas that I've spoken about, and they can all be quite easily used in a online or virtual teaching environment, using breakout rooms, using whole group discussions, using the chat field like I've been using today, using polls, questionnaires. If you have an asynchronous online learning environment, you can use that to upload files, case studies, short videos, get your learners to upload whatever the creative output is from their learning, whether it's a short video or a piece of writing or something like that. And you can use all of these ideas in a face-to-face teaching environment as well. If you would like any more information about the books, please have a look at Cornelissen.de, the website. I mentioned before, and we posted the link to a YouTube video as well. If you have a look at the Cornelissen Verlag YouTube channel, there's a playlist in there specific for business English, if that's your thing. And there's loads of other resources and videos in there as well. But if you're a general English teacher, there's tons of resources and ready to go learning content on the YouTube channel as well that you can use. So that brings me to the end of today's session. I'm trying to move in here to avoid the sun. Yeah, it brings me to the end of today's session. Please do keep in touch. If you've got any questions, we're gonna have about 10 minutes now for questions and discussions. But if you've any that you'd like to follow up with me on later, please do. You can reach me using these various social channels that I've listed on the slide. I also mentioned the YouTube channel. There are a list of the online webinars or workshops that I did last year that are online on the YouTube channel if you want to catch up on anything that I did last year. And I'm also doing another one next week. If you'd like to come and join, the specific focus on that is going to be around using online websites and online resources in your online teaching with your learners. So yeah, very practical session with loads of ideas you'll be able to use the next day. So thank you for those of you who are just posting various links to the channel, to recordings, things like that. That brings me, I think, to the end of the session, at least the input bit from me and the recording bit as well. We're going to stop the recording now. So thanks very much, everyone, for your engagement, interaction, questions, comments, and so on.
Cornelissen. Potenziale entfalten.